The Consciousness Code Podcast, Episode 15, How Manipulation Works, How Influence Enters Awareness Without Being Noticed. Hello, and welcome back to the Consciousness Code Podcast. In the last episode, we explored how identity is shaped through the stories you repeat, how narrative creates continuity, how the self is stabilized through patterns of meaning that feel personal, but are often constructed over time. We saw that identity is not only something you are, but something that is continually told. A story rehearsed until it feels like the truth. But those stories do not form in isolation. They are influenced, shaped, reinforced, not only by your own experience, but by the language, systems, and environments around you. Because if identity is built through narrative, then influence works by shaping the stories you come to believe. And that is where we move today, into manipulation. Not as something extreme or theatrical, not as something reserved for obvious deception or malicious intent, but as something far more ordinary. Something embedded in everyday communication, something that operates quietly, structurally, and often invisibly. Because manipulation is not effective because people are unintelligent, it is effective because consciousness has architecture, and that architecture can be entered, shaped, and directed. Part 1. Influence enters through the architecture of awareness. When most people think about manipulation, they tend to imagine intent first. Someone is trying to deceive. Someone is trying to control. Someone acting with a clear agenda to influence another person's thoughts or behavior. And while intent can certainly be part of manipulation, it is not where its effectiveness comes from. Because if manipulation only worked when someone was actively trying to deceive you, it would be much easier to recognize. It would stand out. It would feel unnatural. But that is not how it works. Manipulation works because it aligns with how awareness already functions. It enters through systems that are always open, always active, always receiving input. And to understand this, you have to shift your focus away from the idea of manipulation as something external, and begin to see it as something that interacts with internal processes, the way attention is directed, the way emotion is activated, the way meaning is formed, the way identity is stabilized. These are not vulnerabilities in the sense of flaws. They are features of consciousness. They are what allow you to navigate the world, to make sense of experience, to respond quickly, to belong, to interpret, to act. But because they are always active, they are also always accessible. And that accessibility is what makes influence possible. Every moment of your life, your attention is being guided, not just by what you consciously choose to focus on, but by what captures your awareness, what stands out, what feels urgent, what feels relevant. Attention is not neutral, it is selective, and whatever it selects begins to shape your perception of reality. Because what you attend to becomes what you experience, and what you do not attend to might as well not exist, at least in that moment. This is one of the primary entry points for influence, not by forcing you to think something, but by guiding what you notice in the first place. Because if attention can be directed, perception follows. And if perception follows, interpretation follows. And if interpretation follows, belief begins to form. This is why manipulation rarely begins with conclusions. It begins with attention. It begins with what is highlighted and what is left out, what is repeated and what is ignored, what is framed as important and what is framed as irrelevant. And most of the time, you do not experience this as manipulation. You experience it as reality, because you are not aware of what you are not seeing. You are only aware of what is present in your field of attention. This is where emotion begins to play its role, because attention alone does not stabilize perception. Emotion does. When something captures your attention and is paired with emotional activation, it becomes more salient, more memorable, more convincing. Emotion narrows the field. It prioritizes certain interpretations over others. It signals importance, urgency, meaning. And when emotion is activated, your capacity for detached analysis often decreases. Not because you are incapable of thinking clearly, but because your system is prioritizing response over reflection. This is not a flaw. It is a survival mechanism. When something feels threatening, exciting, urgent, or significant, your system moves to respond quickly. And in doing so, it relies more heavily on patterns that are already established, familiar interpretations, existing narratives, known meanings. This is where manipulation becomes even more effective, because it does not need to create entirely new beliefs. It can work by activating what is already there, by triggering emotional states that make certain interpretations more likely, by narrowing the field of perception so that alternative viewpoints feel less accessible. And again, this does not feel like manipulation. It feels like certainty. It feels like clarity. It feels like this is obviously what is happening, because the emotional state is shaping the interpretation, and the interpretation feels self-generated. But it is not only attention and emotion that shape awareness. Language plays a central role, because once attention has been captured and emotion has been activated, language begins to organize meaning. It provides structure, it labels, it frames, it defines what something is and what it means. And as we explored in previous episodes, language does not simply describe reality. It shapes it. The words used to describe something influence how it is perceived. The framing of a situation influences how it is interpreted. The same event can be experienced in entirely different ways depending on how it is described. This is where manipulation becomes particularly subtle, because it does not need to lie. It can work through framing, through emphasis, through selective description, through the use of language that directs interpretation without appearing to do so. For example, something can be framed as a threat or as a challenge, as a failure or as a lesson, as an attack or as feedback. And each of these frames carries emotional weight. Each directs perception in a different way. Each leads to different conclusions, different responses, different beliefs. And because language feels like a tool you use, rather than something that shapes you, this influence often goes unnoticed. You hear the words, you process the meaning, and you assume that meaning is inherent, that it reflects reality as it is. But in many cases, what you are responding to is not just the situation itself, but the way it has been framed. And this is where the architecture of awareness becomes clear. Attention determines what enters your field. Emotion determines how important it feels. Language determines how it is understood. And all of this happens rapidly, often below the level of conscious awareness. By the time you become aware of your thoughts, much of the shaping has already occurred. The frame is already in place, the emotional tone is already set, the interpretation is already forming. And this is why manipulation does not feel like something being done to you. It feels like something you have realized, something you have concluded, something that makes sense to you, because it has entered through the systems that generate your experience, not as an external imposition, but as an internal process. This is also why intelligence alone does not protect against manipulation, because manipulation is not primarily targeting logic. It is targeting the processes that shape what feels logical in the first place. It is shaping what appears reasonable, what feels true, what seems obvious. And if those foundations are influenced, then the conclusions that follow will feel self-evident, even if they have been guided. This is where identity begins to enter the picture, because as interpretations are repeated, as certain meanings become familiar, they begin to stabilize into a narrative. And as we explored in the last episode, narrative becomes identity. It becomes the story you hold about who you are, how the world works, what to expect, what to fear, what to trust. And once influence attaches itself to identity, it becomes much more stable, because it is no longer just about what you think. It becomes about who you are. And when something feels like part of your identity, it is much less likely to be questioned. It is defended, reinforced, repeated, because to question, it can feel like questioning yourself. This is why influence that reaches identity becomes self-sustaining. It no longer needs to be applied continuously from the outside. It is maintained internally through repetition, through behavior, through interpretation. And again, this does not feel like manipulation. It feels like authenticity. It feels like conviction. It feels like the truth. But underneath that, the same processes are at work: attention, emotion, language, narrative, all interacting, all shaping awareness, all accessible, all influenceable. This is the key shift in understanding manipulation. It is not something that sits outside of you, trying to force its way in. It is something that enters through systems that are already open, systems that are necessary for your functioning, systems that allow you to perceive, interpret, and act. And because these systems are always active, influence is always possible. Not just from others, but from environments, from media, from repeated exposure, from cultural narratives, from family dynamics, and even from your own internal dialogue. This is where the idea of self-manipulation begins to emerge, because the same mechanisms that allow others to influence you are the ones you use on yourself. The way you frame your experiences, the way you interpret your past, the way you anticipate your future. All of these shape your perception in real time. All of these can reinforce certain beliefs, certain identities, certain narratives, and most of the time, this happens without conscious awareness. You are not deliberately manipulating yourself, but the patterns of interpretation you have learned can continue to shape your experience in ways that feel automatic, familiar, true. This is why manipulation is not an external anomaly. It is an extension of normal functioning. It is what happens when the architecture of. Because manipulation is not overcome by becoming closed. It is understood by becoming aware, and that awareness begins here, by recognizing that influence does not need to force its way into your mind. It enters through the very systems that allow you to experience the world, through the architecture of awareness itself. Part 2. Why manipulation is rarely obvious. If manipulation were obvious, it would fail. If it felt intrusive, unnatural, or clearly imposed from the outside, it would trigger resistance. It would stand out against your sense of reality. It would feel like something is off. But the reason manipulation works as consistently as it does is that it rarely appears in that form. It does not announce itself. It does not feel foreign. It does not feel like something being done to you. It feels like something that makes sense. Something that feels reasonable, something that aligns with how you already see the world. And this is the first illusion that needs to be dismantled. The idea that manipulation is easy to detect. Because most of the time, it is not only difficult to detect, but it is designed to be indistinguishable from your own thinking. It enters in a way that feels familiar. It blends with existing patterns. It aligns with what you already believe, or what you are already inclined to accept. And because of that, it does not trigger suspicion. It feels like confirmation. This is where subtlety becomes the primary mechanism. Not deception in the obvious sense, but alignment. The alignment of language with expectation. The alignment of tone with trust. The alignment of the message with familiarity. Because when something aligns with what you already recognize, it does not need to prove itself. It feels self-evident. It feels like something you already knew, just articulated more clearly. And that is one of the most effective forms of influence, not introducing something entirely new, but reinforcing what is already there in a way that strengthens it. When a message feels familiar, it bypasses scrutiny. Not because you are incapable of analyzing it, but because it does not feel necessary. There is no signal that something needs to be questioned. There is no friction. It fits, and that sense of fit creates acceptance. This is where cognitive ease begins to play a role. The mind prefers what is easy to process, what is fluent, what is recognizable, what does not require significant effort to understand. And when something is easy to process, it often feels more true. Not because it is more accurate, but because it is more accessible. It moves through the system without resistance. It does not require reinterpretation. It does not challenge existing structures. And because of that, it is more likely to be accepted as valid. This is why repeated phrases, familiar wording, and simple framing can be so effective. Not because they are inherently persuasive, but because they reduce the effort required to process the message. And when effort is reduced, acceptance increases. This is not a conscious decision. It is a structural tendency. The mind moves toward what feels smooth, and manipulation often operates within that smoothness. But cognitive ease alone does not explain why manipulation feels like truth. Because beyond ease, there is also familiarity, and familiarity creates a sense of safety. When something feels familiar, it signals that it has been encountered before. That is known, that it belongs within your existing framework. And when something feels known, it does not require the same level of evaluation. It is already partially integrated. This is where familiar language patterns become powerful. Not just the words themselves, but the structure of how something is said, the rhythm, the tone, the phrasing. All of these contribute to whether something feels aligned or not. If the structure of the message matches patterns you have already internalized, it is more likely to be accepted. It feels like it fits within your understanding. It feels like something you would say, or something you would think. And because of that, it is not experienced as influence. It is experienced as recognition. This is also where personal insight becomes a point of vulnerability. Because when something feels like your own realization, it carries more weight. It feels more certain, more grounded, more trustworthy. And manipulation often works by creating the conditions for that feeling to emerge. Not by telling you what to think directly, but by guiding you toward a conclusion that feels like your own. By framing information in a way that leads to a particular interpretation. By presenting pieces in a sequence that encourages a specific meaning to form. And when that meaning arises, it does not feel imposed. It feels discovered. It feels like something you arrived at. And because of that, it is less likely to be questioned. This is why manipulation does not always involve false information. It can operate through selective truth, through partial framing, through emphasis and omission, by highlighting certain aspects of a situation while downplaying others, by guiding attention towards specific details that support a particular interpretation. And because the information itself may not be false, it feels credible. It feels grounded in reality. But the way it is structured shapes the meaning that emerges. And that meaning feels natural. It feels logical. It feels like the most reasonable conclusion. But what is often missed is that other conclusions were possible. Other interpretations were available, but they were not made visible. They were not given the same weight. And because of that, they did not enter awareness in the same way. This is where authority begins to shape perception. Because when a message is delivered from a perceived position of authority, it carries additional weight. Not just because of the content, but because of the source. Authority signals credibility. It signals expertise. It signals trustworthiness. And when something is associated with authority, it often bypasses deeper scrutiny. Not because people are unwilling to question, but because the presence of authority reduces the perceived need to do so. It creates an assumption of validity, an expectation that the information has already been evaluated, and this assumption becomes a shortcut, a way of processing information more efficiently. But that efficiency comes with a trade-off, because when authority is accepted without question, influence can enter more easily, not through force but through trust. This is also where social proof reinforces acceptance, because human beings do not form beliefs in isolation. They look to others, to groups, to collective behavior, and when something appears to be widely accepted, it gains credibility, not necessarily because it is accurate, but because it is shared, because it is repeated, because it is normalized. And normalization is one of the most powerful forms of influence. When something is presented as standard, as expected, as what people do or think, it becomes easier to adopt, not because it is evaluated deeply, but because it feels aligned with the group. And belonging plays a role here. Because to align with the group is to maintain connection. To deviate can feel like separation, and often this dynamic operates below conscious awareness. It is not experienced as pressure, it is experienced as agreement. This is why manipulation often feels like consensus, like common sense, like the obvious conclusion. Because it is reinforced through multiple channels, through repetition, through social reinforcement, through the appearance of shared belief. And when something is repeated enough, it becomes familiar. And when it becomes familiar, it becomes easier to accept. And when it becomes easier to accept, it begins to feel true. This is not a deliberate process. It is an emergent one, a result of how awareness interacts with repetition and familiarity. And this is where blind spots begin to form, not because of a lack of intelligence, but because of the way the system prioritizes efficiency. Trust, authority, familiarity, and repetition all create conditions where information can be processed quickly, where decisions can be made without extensive analysis. And in many situations, this is necessary. It allows for responsiveness, it allows for functioning. But those same conditions can be used to shape perception without it being recognized as such. Because when something feels normal, it does not stand out. When something feels expected, it is not questioned. When something aligns with existing beliefs, it is not examined deeply. And these are the spaces where manipulation operates most effectively. This is why the idea of manipulation as something obvious needs to be dismantled. Because if you are looking for something that feels clearly deceptive, clearly unnatural, clearly imposed, you will miss the forms of influence that are most common. The ones that feel like logic, the ones that feel like clarity, the ones that feel like your own thinking. Because manipulation does not need to disrupt your sense of reality. It can work by reinforcing it, by aligning with it, by subtly shaping it from within. And this is where the core insight of this section becomes clear. The most effective manipulation does not feel like manipulation. It feels like the truth. It feels like understanding. It feels like something that makes sense. And because of that, it is not resisted. It is integrated. It becomes part of how you see the world, not as something external, but as something internal, something that feels like your own perspective. This is also where awareness begins to shift, not by trying to detect manipulation in the obvious sense, but by recognizing the conditions under which influence becomes invisible, by noticing when something feels immediately true without examination, by recognizing when familiarity is guiding acceptance, by becoming aware of how authority and social proof shape perception, not to reject them entirely, but to see their influence. To recognize that what feels natural is not always neutral, that what feels obvious is not always objective, that which feels like your own thinking may have been shaped in ways that are not immediately visible. And this awareness does not require constant suspicion. It does not require you to question everything rigidly or defensively. It simply requires recognition, the ability to notice how something is entering awareness, the ability to see that ease, familiarity, and alignment can shape acceptance, the ability to pause, even briefly, and recognize that the first interpretation is not always the only one, because once that recognition is present, something changes, not in the information itself, but in your relationship to it. You are no longer fully inside the process without awareness. You are observing it as it happens. And in that observation, the invisibility of manipulation begins to reduce, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer entirely unseen. And that is where the next part of this episode will move into the specific mechanisms through which influence operates, not just why it is difficult to detect, but how it actively shapes attention, emotion, and language in real time. Part 3: Attention, Emotion, and Language as Leverage Points. If manipulation works by entering the architecture of awareness, then attention, emotion, and language are three of its most reliable entry points. Not because they are flaws in the human system, but because they are central to how the system functions. They determine what becomes visible, what feels important, and what begins to mean something before deeper reflection has had time to widen the field. So if you can shape attention, trigger emotion, and frame language, you do not need to force belief directly. You shape the conditions under which belief forms. And once those conditions are shaped, perception often follows. Attention is where this usually begins. Because no one can process everything at once. Awareness is selective, it has to be. At any given moment, there are countless details available to perception, but only a small number enter the foreground. What gets highlighted becomes what feels real, relevant, and important. What gets excluded does not necessarily disappear, but it drops from conscious priority. And once something has been excluded, it is less likely to shape interpretation. So influence often begins not with telling you what to think, but with guiding what you notice. This is one of the simplest and most powerful mechanics of influence. If you control what enters the spotlight of awareness, you shape the raw material from which interpretation is formed. You do not need to fabricate reality. You can work by selecting parts of it, by emphasizing certain details, repeating certain images, foregrounding certain themes, and leaving others in the background. Once attention has been directed in this way, perception begins to organize around what is available. And because people tend to interpret from what is salient, rather than from everything that exists, the frame begins to stabilize before analysis has fully begun. This is why attention is not neutral. It is never just a passive spotlight. It is an organizer of experience. Whatever consistently receives attention becomes psychologically enlarged. It starts to feel more common, more urgent, more defining than it might actually be in proportion to the wider reality. If a particular threat is repeatedly highlighted, the system begins to orient toward that threat. If a particular conflict is repeated, it begins to feel culturally central. If a particular kind of failure is emphasized, it can begin to shape how people interpret themselves and others. Attention does not merely register reality. It changes the scale of what reality appears to be. This is where priming begins to matter. Priming is the process by which prior exposure influences later perception, often outside conscious awareness. If attention has already been directed towards certain words, images, or themes, then later experiences are more likely to be interpreted through those cues. The mind does not start fresh each time, it carries activation forward. So if your awareness has been saturated with cues related to danger, betrayal, scarcity, or urgency, later situations are more likely to be interpreted through those lenses. The attention has already been trained in a particular direction, and perception begins to follow the track that has been laid down. Priming often feels invisible because it does not usually announce itself as influence. It simply changes what comes easily to mind. It increases the accessibility of certain interpretations. It makes some meanings feel ready-made, and when something comes easily to mind, it often feels like insight, like instinct, like common sense. But accessibility is not the same as truth. It is often the result of repetition, salience, and prior activation. This is one of the ways influence works so effectively. It does not need to command perception directly. It can be prepared quietly in advance. Once attention has been guided, emotion becomes the amplifier, because emotion tells the system what matters. It assigns weight, it signals relevance, it mobilizes a response, and when emotion is activated, perception narrows, not because the mind becomes irrational in a simplistic sense, but because the system becomes prioritized toward what appears most urgent in that state. Emotional activation changes what is noticed, what is remembered, and what is interpreted as significant. It alters the field. Fear is one of the most obvious examples of this. When fear is activated, the system becomes threat-oriented. Ambiguity is harder to tolerate. The mind looks for clarity, for certainty, for cues that reduce the unknown. Attention narrows toward potential danger. Contradictory evidence may become less accessible, not because it does not exist, but because the system is not prioritizing it. This is why urgency and fear are such powerful leverage points. They accelerate interpretation while reducing reflection. They create movement before wider examination has taken place. But fear is not the only emotional trigger that narrows perception. Shame can do the same. So can outrage, desire, grief, status anxiety, belonging pressure, and moral disgust. Each emotional state organizes awareness differently. Each one changes what becomes salient and how meaning is formed. A person in shame may become highly sensitive to signs of rejection or inadequacy. A person in outrage may become highly selective for cues of wrongdoing or moral threat. A person under belonging pressure may become more attuned to group signals, approval cues, and indications of inclusion or exclusion. Emotion shapes what can be seen. This is why emotional triggers are not merely reactions. They are organizing mechanisms. They do not just happen after meaning has formed. They help determine what meaning is likely to form in the first place. Once a certain state is activated, interpretation begins to move within the logic of that state. Neutral information may no longer land neutrally. Ambiguous signals may be resolved in the direction of the dominant emotion. A pause may feel like rejection. A challenge may feel like humiliation. A boundary may feel like abandonment. The same event, under a different emotional state, could mean something else entirely. But once activation is in place, the range of accessible meanings narrows. This narrowing is one of the reasons manipulation can be so effective without being obvious. Because when a person is emotionally activated, the interpretation that follows often feels earned. It feels like the natural conclusion. It does not feel like something induced. It feels like something seen clearly. But often, what is being experienced as clarity is actually state-dependent narrowing. The emotional field has reduced what is visible and increased the certainty of what remains. And because the body is involved, the interpretation feels real in a way that is difficult to challenge from the outside. Language then enters as the organizer of that narrowed field. If attention selects the material and emotion gives it weight, language determines what kind of thing it is. It labels, it frames, it links the experience to meaning. It decides whether something is seen as evidence, threat, betrayal, injustice, awakening, proof, or failure. And because language often arrives after attention and emotion have already begun shaping perception, it can feel like it is merely describing what is obvious. But it is doing much more than that. It is structuring the reality that is being lived in that moment. This is where framing becomes central. A frame does not just describe an event, it defines the kind of event it is. It tells the mind what category of reality this belongs to. A situation described as a mistake will be received differently from one described as negligence. A difficult conversation framed as honesty will land differently than one framed as attack. A policy described as protection will feel different from one described as control. In each case, the language does not merely follow meaning, it directs it. Framing is powerful because it works before full analysis. It creates the interpretive container within which later details will be understood. Once the frame is in place, incoming information is more likely to be filtered through it. Details that support the frame become more legible. Details that complicate it become less central. This is why language is such an effective leverage point. It can guide meaning without requiring explicit coercion. It can make one interpretation feel obvious and alternative interpretations feel secondary, strained, or even invisible. This is also where narrative shortcuts become important. People do not interpret every situation from zero. They rely on familiar story structures, victim and perpetrator, threat and protection. Corruption and rescue, oppression and awakening, loyalty and betrayal. These narrative patterns help the mind organize complexity quickly. They reduce cognitive load, they make reality easier to process, but they also make influence easier, because if a message can be placed inside a familiar narrative shortcut, it is more likely to be accepted rapidly. It feels like it fits what people already know. Narrative shortcuts are especially powerful when they intersect with emotional triggers. A feared threat is inserted into a moral storyline, a shame trigger embedded within a belonging narrative. A status anxiety is inserted into a framework of worth and failure. Once the emotional state and the narrative structure align, interpretation becomes highly directional. The person does not feel like they are being steered. They feel like the situation is revealing itself. But much of that revelation has been organized by the way attention, emotion, and language have been combined. Urgency signals strengthen this even further. Urgency reduces the perceived value of reflection. It compresses time. It tells the system that waiting is risky, that action must happen now, that uncertainty is dangerous. Under urgency, the mind becomes more likely to rely on heuristics, familiar narratives, and high salience cues. There is less space for proportion, less room for alternative interpretations, and less tolerance for nuance. This is one reason urgency is used so often in persuasive and manipulative environments. It is not only about motivating action, it is about shrinking the field of awareness so that only certain options remain psychologically available. Fear signals work similarly, but with an added survival emphasis. Fear does not just accelerate response, it changes the logic of interpretation. Under fear, safety becomes the metric through which information is assessed. And when safety becomes central, many other values become secondary. Openness, nuance, patience, complexity, doubt, and curiosity all become harder to access when threat dominates the field. This is why fear is such a reliable leverage point. It reorganizes the system around immediacy. It does not need to prove much, because it has already changed the terms under which proof is being evaluated. Belonging pressure can create a comparable narrowing, even when overt fear is absent. Human beings are highly sensitive to social inclusion and exclusion. So when language implies that a certain interpretation aligns with the group, with goodness, with intelligence, with morality, or with safety, that language carries more than semantic meaning. It carries social consequences. To disagree may not just feel like an intellectual divergence, it may feel like alienation. And once belonging is involved, perception becomes more vulnerable to capture. People do not just assess information in relation to facts, they assess it in relation to identity and relationships. All of this helps explain why influence often works best when it seems to arise naturally from the situation itself. The person does not feel manipulated. They feel attentive, emotional, convinced, morally clear, socially aligned, or urgently aware. But those states did not emerge in a vacuum. They were shaped through leverage points. Something was highlighted, something triggered, something framed. The architecture of awareness was entered in a particular sequence, and the result felt like personal insight. This does not mean that every emotionally charged or strongly framed message is manipulative. Influence exists across all human communication. The point here is not to pathologize persuasion or intensity, because once a belief is no longer just something you think, but something that feels tied to who you are, it becomes much harder to question. It stops functioning as a passing interpretation and starts functioning as a stabilizing structure. And this is where manipulation moves deeper, not merely into opinion, not merely into reaction, but into identity itself, into the place where belief, belonging, and selfhood begin to merge. This is one of the most important shifts to understand. Influence becomes far more powerful when it is no longer experienced as external persuasion. When it attaches itself to identity, it begins to feel internal, personal, morally loaded, and socially reinforced. It is no longer just about whether a statement is true or false, useful or unhelpful. It becomes about whether accepting or rejecting it keeps you aligned with who you believe yourself to be, and with the people you believe yourself to belong to. At that point, disagreement is no longer a simple difference in interpretation. It can begin to feel like betrayal, confusion, disloyalty, contamination, or even loss of self. This is why belonging matters so much in the architecture of influence. Human beings do not become conscious in isolation. They develop within relationships through mirroring, approval, correction, imitation, conflict, and shared meaning. From the beginning, belonging is not a small social preference. It is entwined with survival, orientation, and nervous system regulation. To belong is not just to be liked. It is to be held in a field of recognition, to be acknowledged, included, and positioned within a structure of shared reality. And because of that, the threat of exclusion carries extraordinary weight. Even subtle signals of being outside the group can have a disproportionate effect on thought and behavior. This is where beliefs begin to attach to belonging, not always overtly, and not always through direct pressure. Often it happens gradually. Certain views become associated with safety, goodness, intelligence, morality, sophistication, loyalty, strength, or love. Other views become associated with danger, ignorance, selfishness, betrayal, weakness, or moral failure. Once this pairing becomes stabilized, belief is no longer evaluated only on its own terms. It is evaluated through the social meaning attached to it. To hold one view is to remain aligned. To question it is to risk disconnection. This does not always feel coercive. In many cases, it feels natural, even ethical. because the person is not consciously thinking, I am being pressured to believe this. They may instead feel, this is the kind of person I am, or these are my people, or people like us know this. The belief enters identity through repetition, emotional salience, and relational confirmation. It begins to function as part of self-definition. And once that happens, it reinforces itself. The group strengthens the belief strengthens the identity strengthens attachment to the group. This is the beginning of identity capture. Identity capture happens when a belief system, narrative, or frame becomes fused with a person's sense of self and belonging. Once captured in this way, the person does not merely hold the belief. The belief helps hold the person together. It gives structure. It provides certainty. It offers social location. It tells them who they are in relation to others, what side they are on, what values they embody, and what dangers they must resist. This is why captured beliefs are so resilient. They are no longer functioning purely at the level of ideas. They are functioning at the level of self-organization. This is also why logical contradiction often fails to change them. If a belief were merely intellectual, evidence might be enough to shift it. But when identity is involved, contradictory information can feel destabilizing far beyond the level of logic. It may feel like an attack, not just on the idea but on the self. It may threaten belonging, status, coherence, and moral location all at once. So the system does what systems often do under threat. It protects itself. It interprets contradiction through defensive filters. It restabilizes the identity. And in doing so, the influence becomes stronger rather than weaker. Group identity is central here. People do not just think as individuals, they think within fields of identification. Family, friendship circles, political communities, institutional cultures, religious groupings, ideological movements, professional environments, and intimate relationships all generate shared norms about what is sayable, thinkable, admirable, shameful, or dangerous. The group does not need to openly demand conformity to shape it. Often, the cues are enough. What receives approval? What receives silence? What is laughed at? What is treated as obvious? What is rewarded with attention or framed as morally superior? These cues shape the boundaries of acceptable thought. Once those boundaries are in place, belief becomes relational. People do not only ask whether something is true. At an implicit level, they are also tracking, what happens to me if I accept this? What happens to me if I question it? Will I be included, respected, admired, or excluded? These calculations are not always conscious. They are often felt through the body as tension, discomfort, longing, or shame. But they matter, because human beings are exquisitely responsive to group signals. And those signals shape interpretation before conscious reasoning has fully caught up. Shame and approval are two of the strongest tools in this process. Approval expands, it soothes, it signals that you are aligned, recognized, and safe within the shared field. Shame contracts, it signals misalignment, defect, exposure, or risk of exclusion. Neither needs to be dramatic to be effective. A subtle withdrawal of warmth, a slightly different tone, a look of disapproval, a joke at the wrong moment, a public correction, a pattern of social silence, these can all communicate that a boundary has been crossed. And because the nervous system is built to detect relational threat, the effect can be immediate. Beliefs begin to self-correct in order to restore belonging. This is why approval can shape not just behavior but conviction. When a certain viewpoint is repeatedly met with approval, the person not only learns that it is socially rewarded, they may begin to feel that it is more true, more sensible, more coherent. The reward signal affects salience. What is approved becomes easier to return to, easier to repeat, easier to identify with. Over time, the belief may become internalized in such a way that the person no longer experiences it as socially reinforced. It simply feels like their view. But underneath that, the approval structure has played a significant role in stabilizing it. Shame works in the other direction. It narrows the field. It marks certain questions, doubts, or interpretations as risky, not necessarily false, but costly. And because shame is not only an emotional experience but a social one, it often has more influence than contradiction. A person may privately notice a mismatch, an inconsistency, or an unease, but if voicing that awareness risks humiliation, exclusion, or moral condemnation, they may suppress it. Not because they are incapable of seeing clearly, but because the social cost has become too high. This is one reason why manipulation attached to identity can be so difficult to dislodge. It is protected not just by cognition, but by the emotional economics of belonging. Ideological alignment intensifies this even further. When a belief system offers a total framework, a way of interpreting events, people, morality, danger, innocence, purpose, history, and future, it becomes more than a set of opinions. It becomes a world. And within that world, identity can become deeply organized. The person knows who they are, who their allies are, what the threats are, what language to use, what emotions are appropriate, what counts as loyalty, and what counts as betrayal. The ideological frame reduces uncertainty while increasing certainty and cohesion. It creates belonging through shared interpretation. This is why ideological capture often feels meaningful rather than coercive. It answers many questions at once. It simplifies complexity. It turns ambiguity into narrative. It places the individual inside a moral and social order that feels purposeful. And because it provides both explanation and location, it can be deeply regulating. To question it is not just to question a belief. It can mean destabilizing one's place in the field of meaning itself. The person may then cling to the identity more tightly, because loosening it would create too much uncertainty. Loyalty mechanisms emerge from this structure. Once identity and belonging are fused, loyalty becomes one of the most powerful enforcement tools available. Loyalty is not inherently manipulative. It can be beautiful, necessary, and deeply human. But when loyalty is used to suppress discernment, silence doubt, or override direct perception, it becomes a mechanism of capture. The person no longer evaluates information in a relatively open way. They evaluate it through the question of allegiance. What would someone loyal do here? What would someone like us believe? What would it mean if I agreed with the other side? At that point, truth is no longer the only metric. Belonging is in the room. This can happen in political communities, relationships, workplaces, families, activist spaces, spiritual groups, and social subcultures. A family may not need to state openly that certain narratives cannot be questioned. It may be enough that questioning them leads to subtle rejection, distance, or accusations of ingratitude. A workplace may not say directly that dissent is unsafe, but the reward and punishment structures make it clear. A relationship may frame compliance as love and independence as betrayal. A community may equate ideological agreement with moral worth. In each case, identity capture deepens because belief becomes tied to inclusion. What is particularly striking about these dynamics is how often they feel voluntary. The person may insist that they are freely choosing their position, and at one level, that can be true. But freedom of choice is shaped by the conditions under which choice is made. If certain interpretations are met with approval, coherence, warmth, and identity affirmation, while others are met with shame, confusion, or exclusion, the system is not choosing from a neutral field. It is choosing within a charged one, and charged fields produce patterned outcomes. This is where social inclusion versus exclusion dynamics become crucial. Inclusion is not merely about being accepted. It also tells the nervous system what realities are safe to inhabit. Exclusion is not merely about being left out. It tells the system what realities are dangerous to voice or explore. Over time, this creates internal censorship. The person may stop asking certain questions before they fully arise. Certain doubts may never become conscious because the system has already learned their cost. This is not always deliberate suppression. It can be a preconscious narrowing shaped by repeated relational consequences. And because this narrowing often feels like conviction, it can be mistaken for authenticity. The person may feel more certain than ever, more morally clear, more bonded to others, more anchored in purpose. But certainty produced through belonging pressure is not the same as clarity. It may be a stabilized identity response. It may be the result of a system learning which beliefs maintain social safety. This does not make every shared conviction false. It means the route by which conviction forms matters. If it has become inseparable from group approval, then influence is no longer merely persuasive. It is identity binding. This is one reason why people often defend belief systems more fiercely when they are socially embedded than when they are privately held. The threat is larger. To question the belief may not only require intellectual revision, it may require relational reorientation. It may threaten friendships, family roles, professional belonging, spiritual coherence, or moral identity. You are the kind of person who sees what others miss. You are morally awake. You belong with those who truly understand. You are not like them. This is identity seduction. It offers distinction, belonging, purpose, and clarity. Once accepted, it can deepen into obligation, conformity, and narrative capture. But the first step is usually not forced. It is an affirmation. It makes the person feel seen in a way that is deeply regulating. And once that regulating function is in place, the attached beliefs enter more easily. The opposite strategy can also be used. Instead of seduction through affirmation, influence may use shame and deficiency. You are failing unless you align. You are unsafe unless you comply. You are selfish if you question. In this form, identity is captured through fear of exclusion or moral inferiority. The person does not adopt the belief because it feels expansive, but because the alternative feels too costly. Both strategies can work. One offers belonging through elevation, the other through avoidance of shame. In many real-world systems, they are combined. It is also important to recognize that identity capture does not only occur in large groups or ideological systems. It can happen in intimate relationships. One partner may subtly shape what counts as loyalty, what counts as selfishness, what counts as love, and what counts as betrayal. Over time, the other person may begin to evaluate their own perceptions through that relational identity frame. They may doubt themselves, not because they are unintelligent, but because belonging, attachment, and safety have become tied to a certain interpretation of reality. This is one way manipulation becomes deeply personal. It no longer only shapes what is believed, it shapes who the person feels allowed to be. The same can happen within families. Family identity often includes strong narratives about who is sensitive, who is difficult, who is responsible, who overreacts, who causes problems, and who keeps the peace. These are not just descriptions, they are relational identity assignments. And once they are stabilized, they shape behavior, expectation, and self-understanding. A person may spend years inside an identity given to them by the family system, mistaking it for essence rather than structure. That identity then influences how they move through later relationships, institutions, and life choices. The original capture extends outward. The deeper implication here is that identity is not merely personal, it is relationally organized. And because of that, influence targeting identity is often targeting a whole network of meanings at once. It is shaping not only belief, but belonging, regulation, morality, narrative coherence, and behavioral expectation. This is why it becomes self-reinforcing. The person does not need to be constantly reminded of what to believe. Their social world, emotional world, and self-concept now support the belief from multiple directions at once. So the core insight stands. When influence attaches to identity, it becomes self-reinforcing. It is no longer just something taken in from outside. It becomes woven into self-perception, group alignment, moral language, and emotional regulation. It protects itself through belonging pressure, approval, shame, loyalty, and narrative repetition. And because of that, it can remain stable even under contradiction. To see this clearly is not to become cynical about all belonging, all loyalty, or all shared identity. Human beings need these things. They are part of life. The point is not to reject them, but to become aware of how they shape perception. To notice when a belief is being protected, not only because it is true, but because it is tied to inclusion, identity, or moral standing. To recognize when questioning something feels dangerous, not because the idea itself is strong, but because the social architecture around it is powerful. That awareness does not dissolve belonging, it refines it. It creates the possibility of staying connected without surrendering discernment, and that is essential for what comes next. Because once we understand how identity can be captured through belonging pressure, the next question is how perception itself can be destabilized. How gaslighting, reframing, and induced doubt operate within these structures to weaken internal certainty and make the system even easier to direct. Part 5: Gaslighting, Reframing, and Induced Doubt. If attention, emotion, language, and identity show us how influence enters and stabilizes, this section moves into something more corrosive. Not just shaping perception, but destabilizing it. Because one of the most effective ways to direct a person is not only to give them a frame, but to weaken their trust in their own ability to perceive clearly in the first place. Once that trust begins to erode, the person becomes more dependent on external cues, external interpretations, and externally supplied meaning. And that is where gaslighting, manipulative reframing, and induced doubt become so powerful. They do not always work by replacing reality outright. Often, they work by making reality feel less graspable, less stable, and less trustworthy from within. Gaslighting is one of the clearest examples of this. At its core, gaslighting is not simply lying. It is the repeated destabilization of another person's confidence in their own perception, memory, interpretation, or emotional response. It says, in effect, not just you are wrong, but your way of knowing is unreliable, and once that message lands deeply enough, the issue is no longer the original event. The issue becomes the person's relationship to their own mind. Did that happen the way I think it did? Am I overreacting? Am I imagining the pattern? Am I too sensitive, too rigid, too confused, too emotional, too suspicious? This is what makes gaslighting so destabilizing. It shifts the center of uncertainty inward. And once uncertainty has moved inward, manipulation becomes easier, because a person who cannot trust their own interpretation becomes more likely to seek orientation elsewhere. They may begin relying more heavily on the other person's version of events, on the dominant group narrative, on institutional language, on the loudest available explanation, or simply on whatever reduces confusion fastest. The person is no longer only dealing with the external situation. They are dealing with a fracture in their own interpretive ground. This is where distortion becomes deeply effective. It does not need to overpower perception directly. It only needs to weaken confidence in it. Gaslighting often begins subtly. It may not start with dramatic denial. It can begin with small dismissals, slight inversions, repeated minimizations, or quiet implication that the person's reading of the situation is off. You're remembering it wrong. That's not what I meant. You always make things bigger than they are. You're reading too much into it. You're too emotional to see this clearly. On their own, these kinds of statements may sound ordinary, and in some cases, similar phrases can occur in non-manipulative contexts. The difference lies in the pattern, the intention, and the cumulative effect. When the repeated consequence of interaction is that one person becomes less able to trust their own perception, the distortion is doing its work. This is why gaslighting is not only about facts, it is about epistemic confidence. It is about whether you still feel entitled to your own perception, whether you still experience your memory, intuition, bodily signals, and interpretation as valid data. Once those begin to erode, the person becomes more malleable, not because they have become less intelligent, but because their internal orientation has been destabilized. Clarity becomes harder to hold, contradictions become harder to organize, and when this state is sustained, confusion itself begins to function as a control mechanism. Confusion as control is often underestimated, because people tend to think manipulation works best through certainty. But confusion can be even more powerful. A confused person is often easier to direct than a convinced one, because confusion weakens resistance. It creates cognitive fatigue. It makes simple explanations feel disproportionately relieving. It increases the appeal of strong framing, authoritative answers, and externally supplied coherence. When a person becomes overwhelmed by contradiction, inversion, emotional pressure, and shifting interpretations, their system begins to prioritize reduction of uncertainty over independent discernment. The question becomes less what is actually true and more what helps this make sense again. And whoever supplies that sense-making gains leverage. This is where reframing becomes crucial. Reframing, in itself, is not inherently manipulative. In many contexts, it is useful, therapeutic, even liberating. It can widen perception, reduce rigidity, and help people see situations in a more workable light. But manipulative reframing uses the same mechanism for different ends. It does not widen reality. It redirects it. It alters interpretation without changing the underlying facts, often in a way that benefits the manipulator or stabilizes a particular power dynamic. The event remains the same, but what it is said to mean changes. Harm becomes misunderstanding. Control becomes care. Violation becomes a concern. Pressure becomes support. Surveillance becomes protection. Dismissal becomes rationality. By changing the frame, the emotional and moral significance of the event is altered. This is why language inversion plays such an important role in distortion. Inversion occurs when words that ordinarily point toward one reality are redirected to conceal or reverse it. Concern is used to justify intrusion. Honesty is used to excuse cruelty. Loyalty is used to demand submission. Safety is used to legitimize control. Critical thinking is used to rationalize distrust of direct evidence. Compassion is used to avoid accountability. And if that bridge is emotionally or relationally rewarding enough, the person may begin crossing it repeatedly until the new frame feels more stable than their original one. Induced doubt develops within this terrain. If gaslighting attacks epistemic confidence and reframing redirects meaning, induced doubt sustains the instability. It weakens internal certainty without necessarily replacing it immediately. A person begins to hesitate before trusting what they see, feel, remember, or conclude. The system moves from orientation to second guessing. Maybe I'm being unfair. Maybe I'm missing something obvious. Maybe I'm the problem. Maybe my response is the real issue. Again, doubt in itself is not bad. Healthy doubt can widen thinking and reduce rigidity. But induced doubt is not the same as reflective uncertainty. It is strategically shaped uncertainty that consistently weakens the person's access to their own perception while leaving external influence comparatively stronger. This is where reality erosion begins. Reality erosion is not the sudden collapse of a person's grasp on truth. It is the gradual weakening of the internal structures through which truth is sensed, tested, and held. The person still functions. They still think, they may still appear articulate and reflective. But underneath, the internal ground is becoming less stable. Events feel harder to place, meanings feel less reliable, emotional responses are more easily second-guessed. Direct perception no longer feels fully trustworthy on its own, and because of that, external narratives gain strength. The person becomes more dependent on frameworks that organize reality from the outside. Cognitive overload intensifies all of this. When a person is flooded with too many interpretations, too much contradiction, too much emotional activation, too much information, or too many shifting demands, their capacity for coherent processing decreases. Overload does not necessarily produce sharper discernment. This is why distortion is such a powerful tool of manipulation. It does not always need to convince you of a single lie. It can work by making your own clarity feel insufficient. Once perception is destabilized, direction becomes easier. The person may become more compliant, more hesitant, more emotionally dependent, more suggestible, or more likely to default to the strongest available frame. And the more this process repeats, the more self-reinforcing it can become. A person who has been repeatedly taught to distrust their own perception may begin doing that work internally even without external pressure. They preemptively second-guess themselves. They minimize their own direct knowing. They treat their clarity as suspect. At that point, the distortion has been internalized. This is also why recovery from these dynamics is not only about learning the truth. It often involves rebuilding trust in one's own interpretive capacities, relearning the difference between confusion and complexity, re-establishing a relationship to bodily signals, memory, emotional responses, and perception that is not automatically subordinated to external authority. That process can take time, because what has been weakened is not just a set of beliefs, but the person's felt permission to know what they know. So the core insight of this section holds clearly: destabilize perception, and the system becomes easier to direct. Not because people are foolish, but because a system without a trusted internal orientation will naturally seek coherence elsewhere. Gaslighting weakens self-trust. Reframing redirects meaning. Induced doubt sustains internal instability. Confusion and overload reduce resistance. And once those elements combine, influence no longer needs to appear forceful. It can feel like the only available structure left standing. Part 6: Ethics. Clarity versus colonization. If the previous sections have shown how influence works, how attention can be directed, emotion activated, language framed, identity stabilized, and perception destabilized, then this part asks a different question. Not how influence functions, but how it is used. Because influence in itself is not the problem. It is unavoidable. Every interaction carries influence. Every word shapes something. Every tone, every pause, every implication alters the relational field in some way. The question is not whether influence exists. The question is what kind of influence is taking place, and what it does to the awareness of the person receiving it. This is where the distinction between clarity and colonization becomes important. Clarity supports awareness. Colonization overrides it. Clarity allows a person to remain oriented within their own perception while engaging with new information. Colonization gradually replaces that orientation with something externally directed, often without the person fully realizing it. Both involve influence, but they move in very different directions. Clarity-based influence works by adding perspective without removing agency. It offers information, interpretation, or framing in a way that the other person can engage with, question, accept, or reject. It does not require submission. It does not depend on confusion. It does not destabilize the person's sense of self to land. Instead, it tends to preserve or even strengthen the person's ability to think, feel, and discern. The interaction may be persuasive, but it is not coercive. It invites participation rather than enforcing alignment. Colonizing influence moves differently. It does not simply offer perspective. It seeks to install it, often subtly, often gradually. It may rely on many of the mechanisms already explored: attention capture, emotional activation, identity pressure, reframing, or induced doubt, but the key difference is in the outcome. Colonizing influence reduces the person's access to their own awareness. It narrows their interpretive field. It increases dependency on the external frame. It makes alternative perspectives feel less available, less valid, or less safe to hold. Over time, the person's internal orientation becomes less primary than the structure being imposed from outside. This is why the ethical question is not, is influence happening? But what is happening to awareness within the influence? Is the person becoming more able to see, or less? More able to hold multiple perspectives, or more constrained? More connected to their own perception, or more reliant on the one being provided? These are the markers that differentiate guidance from control. Consent plays an important role here, but not in a simplistic sense. Consent is not only about explicit agreement. It is about whether a person is in a position to meaningfully engage with what is being presented. If influence is occurring in a way that bypasses awareness, through pressure, confusion, urgency, identity threat, or emotional overwhelm, then the surface appearance of consent can be misleading. A person may appear to agree, comply, or align, but that agreement may not be grounded in clear perception. It may be the result of narrowed awareness, not open engagement. This is why awareness itself becomes the central ethical reference point. When awareness is preserved, influence can be examined. It can be felt, questioned, explored, and either integrated or declined. When awareness is overridden, influence becomes harder to see. It operates beneath the level of reflection. It shapes perception before the person has the chance to orient to it. And once that happens, the person may experience the outcome as their own thinking, even when the process that produced it was externally structured. Transparency becomes another key distinction. Clarity-based influence tends to be more transparent in its intent. It does not need to conceal its direction. It can say, in effect, this is what I am suggesting, or this is the perspective I am offering. It allows the other person to see the frame being presented. Colonizing influence often depends on some degree of concealment, not necessarily dramatically or deceptively, but in a structural one. The influence is embedded within language, tone, context, or framing in such a way that it does not present itself as influence. It appears as obvious, natural, or self-evident. It reduces the likelihood that the person will step back and examine it. This does not mean that all subtle influence is unethical. Subtlety is part of communication. But when subtlety is combined with pressure, identity attachment, emotional activation, or distortion in a way that reduces awareness, the ethical line begins to shift. The person is no longer simply being communicated with. They are being shaped without full participation. This is where persuasion begins to transition into manipulation. Persuasion, in its healthier form, still allows space for the other person's perception to exist. It may be directional, but it does not require the collapse of alternative viewpoints. Manipulation, by contrast, often involves closing that space. It makes one interpretation feel inevitable, necessary, or unquestionable. It reduces the person's ability to step outside the frame and consider other possibilities. And it often does this not by force, but by structuring the conditions under which perception occurs. Responsibility in communication, then, is not simply about being honest in a factual sense. It is about being aware of how one's communication affects the awareness of others. It is about recognizing that language, tone, and framing do not just convey information, they shape perception. And with that comes a level of responsibility that goes beyond content. This becomes particularly relevant in contexts where there is asymmetry of authority, expertise, emotional dependence, or social power. In these situations, the impact of influence can be amplified. A teacher, a leader, a partner, a parent, a public figure, or a system does not influence in the same way as a peer. The weight of their language carries further. The room for disagreement may be smaller. The cost of misalignment may feel higher. In these contexts, preserving awareness becomes even more important because the conditions are already more susceptible to colonizing dynamics. At the same time, this is not a call to withdraw from influence altogether. That would be neither realistic nor desirable. Influence is how ideas move, how understanding develops, how relationships deepen, and how guidance is offered. The aim is not to eliminate influence, but to bring awareness to how it is used, to recognize when communication supports clarity and when it begins to override it. There is also a personal dimension to this. It is not only about how others influence you, but how you influence others. Every time you explain, persuade, advise, challenge, or guide, you are participating in this dynamic. Are you opening space for the other person's awareness or narrowing it? Are you offering perspective or installing it? Are you engaging with their perception or subtly replacing it? These questions are not about perfection. They are about orientation. Because it is easy to assume that manipulation is something others do, something external, something obvious. But influence is relational. It flows in both directions. And without awareness, it is possible to reproduce the same patterns we recognize elsewhere, to frame in ways that feel justified, to apply pressure in ways that feel reasonable, to prioritize agreement over understanding, to close down alternative views because they create discomfort. None of this requires malicious intent. It can arise from certainty, from urgency, from the desire to help, or from the belief that one's perspective is correct. But the effect on awareness can still be the same. So the ethical line is not defined only by intention, it is defined by impact. Does the interaction leave the other person more able to think and feel clearly, or less? More connected to their own perception, or more dependent on yours? More open, or more constrained? These are the signals that matter. And this is where the core insight becomes clear. The difference is not in influence itself, but whether awareness is preserved or overridden. Influence that preserves awareness allows the person to remain in relationship with their own perception while engaging with what is being offered. Influence that overrides awareness gradually replaces that relationship, often without being named as such. Once you begin to see this distinction, it becomes easier to navigate influence without becoming closed or defensive. The goal is not to reject all persuasion, nor to become immune to every form of framing. That is neither possible nor necessary. The goal is to remain aware of what is happening to your own perception within the interaction, to notice when clarity is being supported and when it is being narrowed, to sense when you are being invited into understanding and when you are being guided away from your own. Because in the end, the most important thing that can affect you is not what you think, but how you relate to your own awareness. And that is where the ethical boundary truly sits. Part 7: Integration, becoming harder to capture without becoming closed by this point. The mechanics of influence are no longer abstract. You have seen how attention is guided, how emotion narrows perception, how language frames meaning before analysis, how identity stabilizes belief, and how distortion weakens internal clarity. But understanding these mechanisms is only part of the process. Integration is where that understanding becomes lived, not as a defensive posture, not as suspicion, but as awareness in motion. Because the goal is not to become resistant to influence in a rigid sense. That often leads to its own distortion. Hyperdefensiveness can narrow perception just as much as manipulation can. It can create a state where everything is treated as suspect, where openness collapses, where connection becomes difficult, and where the nervous system remains in a subtle form of threat vigilance. That is not clarity, that is contraction. Integration moves differently. It is not about shutting down influence, but about seeing how it enters. It is about recognizing the moment where perception begins to shift, before it fully settles into belief. It is about staying present enough within your own system that influence does not pass through unnoticed. This requires a different relationship with attention. Attention is not just something you have. It is something that is continuously being shaped. From a neuroscientific perspective, attention operates through networks that prioritize salience, what stands out as important, relevant, or urgent. The brain is constantly filtering sensory input, selecting what to amplify and what to ignore. This process is influenced by prior experience, emotional state, predictive models, and environmental cues. When attention is captured externally, especially through emotionally charged or high salience signals, the brain's filtering system narrows. This is not a failure, it is an adaptive response. The amygdala and related threat detection systems signal importance, and the prefrontal cortex begins organizing perception around that signal. But in this narrowing, nuance is often lost. Peripheral information drops away. Alternative interpretations become less available. The system becomes more directional. Integration involves becoming aware of this narrowing as it happens. Noticing when your attention feels pulled, rather than chosen. Noticing when something feels urgent, emotionally loaded, or immediately meaningful. Not as a reason to reject it, but as a signal to pause. Because that pause interrupts automatic capture. This pause has a somatic dimension. It is not only cognitive. When attention is captured, the body often shifts. There may be subtle tension, a tightening in the chest, a quickening of breath, a narrowing of visual focus, a change in posture. These are not separate from cognition. They are part of the same process. The nervous system is orienting. It is preparing for action, interpretation, or response. When you bring awareness to these signals, you are not analyzing them from a distance. You are re-entering the system as it operates. This is where regulation begins to matter, because a regulated nervous system has more capacity to hold multiple possibilities. It is less likely to collapse into a single frame. It can tolerate ambiguity for longer. It can process without immediate closure. Regulation, however, is not always comfortable. This is often overlooked. When the nervous system begins to settle, especially if it has been accustomed to activation, that settling can feel unfamiliar, even threatening. The absence of urgency can feel like a loss of control. The reduction of intensity can feel like something important is missing. In some cases, calm itself can trigger unease. From a physiological perspective, this makes sense. The autonomic nervous system is shaped by repeated states, If a person has spent significant time in sympathetic activation, heightened alertness, urgency, and emotional intensity, then that state becomes familiar. It becomes a reference point. When the system moves toward parasympathetic regulation, slower breath, reduced tension, wider perception, it may initially feel disorienting. The system is not used to operate from that baseline. This is where integration requires patience, because becoming harder to capture is not only about recognizing external influence, it is about stabilizing internal conditions that allow recognition to occur. A dysregulated system is more susceptible to influence not because it is weak, but because it is operating under constraint. Its priority is resolution, safety, or coherence. It is more likely to accept strong frames, familiar narratives, or emotionally relieving interpretations because those reduce internal strain. As regulation increases, so does flexibility. The prefrontal cortex, particularly regions associated with executive function and cognitive control, becomes more active when the system is not overwhelmed. This allows for reflection, comparison, and the holding of multiple perspectives. It allows you to notice influence without immediately collapsing into or rejecting it. There is also a predictive dimension to this. The brain does not passively receive information. It actively predicts. It uses prior models to anticipate what is likely to occur, and then updates those models based on incoming data. This is often referred to as predictive processing. Within this framework, perception is not purely objective. It is shaped by expectation. Manipulation works, in part, by shaping those expectations. Repeatedly exposing a person to certain frames, narratives, or emotional associations, it influences what the brain predicts. And once something is predicted, it is more likely to be perceived, even if the evidence is ambiguous. Integration involves becoming aware of this predictive layer. Noticing when something feels immediately obvious, immediately true, immediately familiar. Again, not rejecting it, but holding it lightly enough that alternative interpretations remain possible. This is not indecision. It is cognitive flexibility. Emotion plays a central role here as well. Emotional activation is not separate from cognition. It shapes it. When a person is emotionally activated, whether through fear, anger, excitement, or desire, their perceptual field narrows. This is linked to both evolutionary survival mechanisms and neural efficiency. The brain prioritizes speed and action over nuance and reflection. This is why emotional triggers are so effective in influencing. They do not need to convince you through logic. They shift the conditions under which logic operates. They alter the state in which interpretation occurs. Integration means noticing emotional activation as it arises, feeling it in the body, naming it if necessary, not as a way of suppressing it, but as a way of bringing it into awareness. When emotion is seen, it becomes one factor among many. When it is unseen, it becomes the organizing force. There is also a relational and interpersonal dimension to this. Human beings do not regulate in isolation. The nervous system is influenced by other nervous systems. Through processes often described as co-regulation, one person's state can affect another's. This is mediated through facial expression, tone of voice, body language, and subtle physiological cues. When you are in the presence of someone calm, grounded, and coherent, your system may begin to mirror that state. When you are in the presence of someone agitated, urgent, or dysregulated, your system may begin to mirror that instead. This is not conscious imitation. It is a biological process. Integration involves becoming aware of these shifts, noticing how your state changes in different environments, around different people, within different conversations, not as judgment, but as data. These shifts affect how you think, what you believe, and how you interpret what is happening. From a spiritual perspective, this can be understood as sensitivity to the field. The idea that consciousness is not isolated but participatory, that we are continuously interacting with and being shaped by the energies, emotions, and states around us. Whether one frames this in neurological, psychological, or more symbolic terms, the experience is recognizable. Some environments feel clear. Others feel heavy, confused, or destabilized. Some interactions leave you more grounded. Others leave you fragmented. Integration is not about avoiding all challenging environments. It is about maintaining awareness within them, about noticing when your state shifts, when your clarity changes, when your perception narrows or expands. This awareness creates space, and in that space, influence becomes more visible. Philosophically, this aligns with the idea that freedom is not the absence of influence, but the capacity to relate to it consciously. You cannot remove yourself from all framing, all language, all relational dynamics, but you can become aware of how they are shaping you, and that awareness changes the relationship. This is where discernment develops, not as a fixed set of rules, but as a sensitivity to process. You begin to notice patterns, where your attention is most easily captured. Which emotional states make you more suggestible? Which language patterns feel immediately trustworthy? Where belonging begins to influence your thinking? These are not abstract questions. They are live observations. Where does your attention get captured most easily? Is it urgency, conflict, novelty, validation, or fear? What emotional states narrow your perception? Is it anger, excitement, anxiety, or desire? What kinds of language do you trust without question? Authority, certainty, familiarity, moral framing. Where does belonging shape your thinking? Where does the desire for inclusion, approval, or alignment influence your interpretation? These questions are not about finding fault. They are about mapping your own system, because influence does not enter randomly. It enters through pathways that already exist, through sensitivities, patterns, expectations, and needs. When you begin to see these pathways, you do not become immune to influence, but you become less automatic. There is a moment, even if brief, where you can notice what is happening before it fully takes hold. And in that moment, you have options. Not to reject, not to accept blindly, but to observe. There is also a deeper shift that occurs here. As awareness increases, identity becomes less rigidly tied to immediate interpretation. You are less likely to fuse completely with each thought, each emotional reaction, each narrative. There is a sense that these are processes occurring within you, not definitions of you. This creates a form of psychological flexibility. You can engage without being fully captured. You can listen without immediately aligning. You can feel without being overwhelmed. You can consider without collapsing into certainty. This is not detachment in a cold sense. It is presence with awareness. It allows for openness without loss of orientation. Because becoming harder to capture does not mean becoming closed. It means becoming aware of how capture happens. It means recognizing the mechanisms without needing to defend against every instance. It means staying engaged while maintaining a relationship with your own perception. And this is the integration takeaway. You do not need to resist influence. You need to see how it enters. Throughout this episode, we have explored how manipulation does not operate through obvious force, but through the normal functioning of the human mind and body. How attention is guided before you realize it. How emotion shapes perception before you have time to analyze it. How language frames meaning before you have the chance to question it. How identity and belonging stabilize beliefs in ways that feel personal, but are often structurally reinforced. We have seen how distortion does not always replace reality, but can destabilize your relationship to it. How doubt can be induced not to encourage reflection, but to weaken internal certainty. How familiarity, repetition, and emotional salience can make something feel true before it has been examined. And through all of this, one thing becomes clear. Manipulation is not effective because people are unintelligent. It is effective because it works with the architecture of consciousness itself. It enters through processes that are already there. It shapes perception before awareness intervenes. And when those processes remain unseen, influence becomes easier to accept as your own thinking. But awareness changes that, not by removing influence, but by interrupting its automaticity, by creating space between what is presented and what is believed. And why some environments clarify your thinking, while others quietly distort it. Because influence is not only cognitive, it is relational. It moves through the nervous system, through presence, through the subtle exchange between human beings. And once that is seen, awareness expands again. So, to close this episode, I leave you with this. Notice what is shaping your awareness before you call it your own. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to the Consciousness Code podcast, episode 15, How Manipulation Works, How Influence Enters Awareness Without Being Noticed. Until next time, I'm James Miller.